Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a story that starts out as one of the most chilling, eerie legends of the 20th century, but ends with a sobering historical truth that you absolutely need to know. We're going to deconstruct the famous mystery of Angikuni Lake. We'll look at the sensational myth that completely captivated the world, and then we'll uncover the heavily documented but totally overshadowed reality.
Picture this. It's November 1930. A French-Canadian fur trapper named Joe Labelle arrives at a familiar fishing settlement right on the shores of Angikuni Lake, deep in the Canadian Arctic. He's expecting a warm welcome, maybe a fire, but instead, he steps into an overwhelming, eerie silence. Every single caribou skin tent is standing. Every kayak is beached, but the camp is entirely abandoned. He finds cooking pots still suspended over cold fire pits, with the food still inside. And the creepiest part? There isn't a single set of tracks leading away from the camp in the fresh snow. It's a scene of pure suspense and dread. Just, where did everyone go?
According to the legend, roughly 30 inhabitants were gone without a trace. You've got this uneaten caribou stew and sled dogs literally frozen solid at their leashes. But the absolute clincher, the detail that convinced everyone something highly sinister had happened, was that their rifles were left leaning against the shelters. Think about that for a second. In the harsh, unforgiving reality of the Arctic, Inuit hunters would never willingly leave prized rifles behind. It just made zero sense. And to top the whole spooky scene off, the nearby stone graves were reportedly found smashed and completely emptied.
So how did this story spread like wildfire? Well, it kicked off with a November 1930 article in the Halifax Herald by a reporter named Emmett E. Kelleher. Almost immediately, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an investigation, and by 1931, they found absolutely no foundation for the story. No missing families, no vanished village. Case closed, right? Nope. The truth didn't even slow the legend down. Fast forward to 1959, and a broadcaster named Frank Edwards publishes a book called Stranger Than Science. He dramatically embellishes the tale, inflating the population to over 1,000 people, throwing in mysterious blue UFO lights in the sky, and just completely ignoring the RCMP's findings. By 1976, the Mounties were so fed up that they officially labeled it a hoax, but honestly, by then, the myth had totally eclipsed the truth.
Here's the thing. The whole myth hinges on the idea of a permanent village of 1,000 people vanishing overnight. But the reality? The caribou Inuit didn't even live in permanent villages. This was simply a temporary autumn caribou camp. These families moved constantly with the caribou herds. Leaving heavy possessions behind, like extra cooking gear, and yes, sometimes even those heavy rifles, was completely standard seasonal practice. They cached these items safely because they fully intended to return the following autumn. So Joe Labelle didn't stumble upon an alien abduction site. He simply walked into a totally ordinary, seasonally empty camp.
Let's shift gears and look at the real people who actually lived and thrived in the Kivalliq region, the Podlermute and Ahirmute bands of the caribou Inuit. Unlike coastal Inuit, these families didn't hunt seal or live in igloos for most of the year. Their entire existence, their economy, their calendar, their very survival was intricately tied to the migration of the Kamanirjuak caribou herd. We really need to remember these faces, because while the rest of the world was obsessing over fictional UFOs at Angikuni Lake, a very real, very quiet catastrophe was unfolding for these exact families.
Section 1. The True Disappearance. 8%. That is the devastating toll the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic took on the entire Canadian Inuit population. And for inland groups like the Podlermute and Ahirmute, what came next was even worse, a brutal tuberculosis epidemic. You see, Hudson's Bay Company traders, missionaries, and police brought in pathogens that the Inuit simply had no immunity against. Tuberculosis practically hollowed out these communities. These people weren't abducted by aliens. They were being decimated by introduced diseases and facing severe famine as the caribou herds drastically declined.
These are the human faces behind this history. These are the real people whose stories were completely erased by that Angikuni legend. As they were facing unimaginable starvation and sickness, they were also subjected to some truly catastrophic government interventions. The Canadian state failed to provide necessary medical care or famine relief in time, and when they finally did decide to step in, their solution just ended up accelerating the cultural destruction.
That government intervention quickly escalated into a heavily documented tragedy. Between 1949 and 1959, the Canadian government forcibly relocated the Ahirmute. They were moved first to Newelton Lake and then to Hennick Lake. These were places far away from their traditional hunting grounds, in areas where they had absolutely no knowledge of the local caribou migration patterns. The results were deadly. People starved, people froze to death. And it wasn't until 2019, literally decades after the UFO myth took over pop culture, that the Canadian government finally issued a formal apology and financial compensation to the survivors of those forced relocations.
Section 2. Depriving mobility. The sled dog killings.
The tragedy definitely didn't stop at relocations. The Kekitani Truth Commission uncovered a chilling historical directive. I'll read it right here. Quote, "The dogs, their main means of transportation, were shot by police under federal government orders to deprive Inuit of their mobility and autonomy and to tie them to settlements. The goal was literal forced assimilation." When Joe Labelle reported frozen dogs at Angikuni back in 1930, it sparked all sorts of wild, paranormal theories. But the actual destruction of Inuit sled dogs was an intentional, highly documented government policy enforced by the RCMP.
Now, you might be wondering, why didn't the Inuit speak out about this right away? Well, that brings us to a vital concept called ilira. It's defined as the profound sense of intimidation and vulnerability you feel when facing people who hold unchecked power over you. For decades, many Inuit witnesses remained silent about the dog killings and the forced relocations purely because of ilira toward the RCMP and the government. They were intimidated by an authority that couldn't be controlled or predicted.
And get this. While the Inuit were dealing with all of this real-world trauma, settler society was busy printing ghost stories. The original 1930 Halifax Herald article that launched the whole Angikuni myth didn't even bother to use a real photo of the lake. They literally grabbed a generic stock photo of an entirely different Inuit camp straight from the RCMP's own archives and presented it to the public as the vanished village. It's just a stark example of how a mystery was entirely fabricated out of stock imagery while the actual, tangible evidence of real people's lives was completely ignored.
If there is just one thing you take away from this explainer today, let it be this. The legend of Angikuni Lake is a 90-year case study in manufacturing a mystery to avoid looking at a real tragedy. Frank Edwards and generations of paranormal writers basically filled the space where the true history of the Caribou Inuit should have been told. The real disappearance wasn't supernatural. It was demographic, it was political, and it was entirely human-made.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative question to reflect on. Why do we prefer a fabricated UFO mystery over the documented history of the people who actually lived there? Is it just because aliens are easier to digest than the deep discomfort of forced relocations and cultural erasure? Think about how easily our media and mythology can overwrite the truth. And please, remember the Caribou Inuit the next time you hear a spooky story about a vanished village. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.